He was just a teenager sitting across from detectives, whispering words that would travel far beyond Baton Rouge. He said he pulled the trigger because someone bigger told him to, and that statement alone would flip his whole world upside down. A street kid barely old enough to vote tied to rap beef, fast money, and bodies dropping too quick. The city already had a reputation for violence, but this story would push it to another level. The name he mentioned was a local rap legend, and the dollar figure was shockingly small. But before that night, before that tape, we gotta rewind. Baton Rouge was not just another Louisiana city. It was a place that carried scars deep inside its neighborhoods. Folks called it Red Stick, but the name felt almost ironic because the red that stained its streets came from blood more often than anything else. By the mid-'80s, factories had dried up, jobs had moved, and white flight had left whole communities abandoned. Poor schools, empty homes, and a lack of opportunity made the north side of the city feel like a trap with no exit. The crack epidemic hit Baton Rouge like a storm in the late '80s, leaving whole blocks drowning in smoke and gunfire. Kids barely in their teens carried pistols like toys, and older hustlers taught them that survival was tied to firepower. When the '90s rolled around, murder numbers climbed, and the local coroner admitted he was seeing more bullets inside bodies than ever before. By the time 2009 came, Baton Rouge had become one of the most violent cities in America. News reports in 2009 told stories that repeated like broken records. A couple leaving a movie got shot in their van. A man was gunned down outside a bar, and young men were killed behind houses before they even hit 20. Witnesses were too scared to speak, and prosecutors whispered that potential testimony often vanished because those same witnesses were killed before court. On the north side, teenagers posed in parking lots with AK-47s, chasing both respect and fear. Still, there was music running alongside that chaos. Baton Rouge had a rap scene that spoke straight from the blocks. Lil Boosie rapped about pain and survival, Webby gave the streets a voice, Kevin Gates dropped stories of betrayal, and Max Minnelli documented the daily grind. Their lyrics made folks proud, but they also blurred the line between storytelling and reality. To some listeners, these artists were prophets, but to law enforcement, they were suspects. Police started treating rappers like they were crime bosses in disguise, raiding homes and putting them under surveillance. In that pressure cooker, the city produced stars who spoke for the streets, but it also produced teenagers like Michael Marlowe Mike Loudon, who believed those same stars were the definition of power. Torrance Hatch grew up in that same environment, and the streets shaped everything about his story. He lost his father when he was still young, and by his teenage years, he was already surrounded by hustlers and poverty. Raised in one of the hardest parts of Baton Rouge, he turned to music as a way to escape, and the neighborhood gave him endless material to rap about. Boosie started making a name with gritty lyrics that reflected real life on the block. His early songs carried details of drugs, betrayal, and struggle that felt too real to be fiction. By the early 2000s, tracks like Set It Off and later Wipe Me Down became anthems, spreading far beyond Baton Rouge and putting him on the national stage. He was admired in the city because he kept his words raw and unfiltered, and he was feared because those same words sounded like coded messages from the block. Police noticed too. Boosie complained in interviews that cops pulled him over, threw his cash on the freeways, and even sliced his car seats just to make a point. To officers, he was not just an entertainer, he was a problem. The streets loved him because he was unapologetically Baton Rouge, but the system treated him like a gangster hiding behind beats and rhymes. Rumors began to swirl about his label, Trill Entertainment. Some locals whispered that it was more than music, that it was a front for hustling and dirty money. None of that was ever proven, but in a city like Baton Rouge, rumors stuck harder than facts. To kids like Michael Loudon, Boosie was more than a rapper. He was a living example of power, money, and loyalty. Michael Louding was born in 1992 on the north side of Baton Rouge, where poverty ruled every block. His childhood was not soft, his father was absent, and his mother worked shifts just to survive. Violence filled his environment early, and by middle school, he had already seen a man shot in the street. Teachers described him as restless, and he drifted from one failing grade to another until school pushed him out. By 14, he carried a record that already looked ugly for someone that young. Reports showed juvenile charges for battery, robbery, and drug possession before most kids even got a first job. That same year, he was expelled from school for bringing a pistol, a move that showed how guns had already shaped his thinking. Home never gave him stability, and the streets were raising him faster than family. When Boosie stepped in, people thought it might be a lifeline. Boosie signed as his guardian so he could play basketball with a local team, giving him paperwork and a chance. But basketball could not hold him because he was still drawn to fast money and older homies. People around him said he smoked heavy and stayed high, drowning thoughts that he admitted sometimes told him to kill. Court records later showed he heard voices but refused treatment and laughed off suggestions of counseling. Friends remembered him as quiet, the type who followed instead of leading. He idolized the character Marlo Stanfield from The Wire, a ruthless kingpin who lived by fear and respect. From that show, he created his own identity as Marlo Mike, living half in reality and half in fantasy. By 16, he was walking a line that few come back from, because the difference between a young hustler and a paid shooter is not far in Baton Rouge. The streets around him demanded proof every day, and by then, the line between teenager and killer was already blurring. In February 2009, Baton Rouge lost another rapper when Chris Nussy Jackson was shot in the head at a home on Vermilion Drive.
I worry about the safety of everybody, period. Not just rap artists, everybody. It could be a random. I mean, no one knows if it was rap related, no one knows if it was, beef related. No one knows at this point.
He had been building a local buzz, gaining fans for his raw delivery and sharp energy, but his music career was tied up in a heated beef with Boosie, and everyone in the city knew it. That beef was not quiet, and it was not handled only in lyrics. During police questioning later that year, Michael Louding told detectives that Boosie wanted Nussy stamped out. His confession described how he and Michael Ghost Judson carried out the killing. He said Ghost reminded him of Boosie's demand, and when the job was done, Boosie allegedly told him he liked what they did. The tape shocked prosecutors and became one of the most important pieces in their case. But the story did not stay clean because Louding would later recant. In court, he claimed he only told police what they wanted to hear after hours of pressure. He said detectives threatened to jail his parents, and he was just trying to protect his family. The jury still heard the taped confession, which left questions hanging about what was true and what was coerced. Street talk made the situation even heavier. Hip Hop DX reported rumors that Boosie had placed a $30,000 bounty on Nussy's head. Other blogs repeated that same number, though nothing was proven inside a courtroom. Prosecutors never filed direct charges against Boosie for that murder, and the whispers remained just whispers. The community took Nussy's death hard because many believed he was finally ready to squash the beef. XXL later wrote that Nussy had told his family he wanted to end the feud, but he never got that chance. His fans described him as charismatic, a performer who carried real energy on stage, and his murder left children without their father. The killing of Nussy showed Baton Rouge how fragile that line was between rap beef and real life. Lyrics that once stayed on wax now spilled onto streets, and the result was permanent. Police saw the city spiraling, with music and murder intertwined in ways that made cases harder to separate. For the streets, it was proof that clout could be deadly when money and pride were added. This was not just another murder, in the city's violent cycle. It was the first step in what prosecutors would later describe as a trail of blood connected to a teenager barely old enough to drive. Nussie's body marked the opening chapter of Marlo Mike's reputation, and after Nussie, the killings did not slow down, they came faster. By April 2009, Baton Rouge already had blood in the streets, and the name Michael Louding was starting to be whispered. On April 25th, 20-year-old Marcus Thomas was driving his SUV down West McKinley Street when bullets ripped through the vehicle. His car slammed into a tree and he died right there inside the wreck. Investigators said he had been hit multiple times, and the way it went down fit the pattern that was beginning to form around Louding. It was another young life lost and another case that pointed back toward the same circle of violence. 6 months later came the centerpiece case, the one that made national headlines. Around 12:30 a.m. on October 21st, 2009, 35-year-old Terry Boyd was sitting in the living room of a house on Vermilion Drive. He had been recently released from prison, and people said he was trying to get his life straight. Without warning, 6 bullets came flying through the front window, striking him and ending his life instantly. According to police, Boyd never had a chance to move or react. When detectives pressed Louding in questioning, he gave them the story they were waiting for. He said that he, Adrian Pittman, and Michael Ghost Judson had met at Boosie's house before the hit. He told them that Boosie had offered $25,000 for the job, but when it was done, all he ever saw was $2,800 in cash. In his taped confession, Louding described walking up to Boyd's window, pulling out a 9mm and firing several rounds into the house. Then he said he went back to Boosie's spot and the money was handed over. The prosecution leaned hard on that confession because it was graphic and detailed. They pointed to a tattoo Louding got afterward, an AK-47 with the words, "Yo Boosie, who's next?" To them, that tattoo looked like a trophy, almost a signature carved into his own skin. But in court, Louding changed his story, telling jurors that detectives had pressured him for hours before the camera was turned on. He said they threatened his parents and he was just a scared teenager saying what they wanted to hear. December 2009 brought another body, this time 19-year-old Michael Smith. He was found shot behind a home, and again the shooting carried the same markers of retaliation and street politics. Prosecutors tied Louding to that killing too, stacking charges against him as the months rolled on. On April 1st, 2010, 2 more men were gunned down while sitting inside a Cadillac. Charles Matthews, just 20 years old, and 18-year-old Daryl Bleak Milton were both killed in the ambush. Witnesses said multiple shooters surrounded the vehicle and opened fire, leaving the young men dead inside the car. Milton had been a basketball player with dreams bigger than his block, and Matthews was known as a quiet kid who kept to himself. What shocked people most was that Louding attended Milton's funeral and even hugged his mother, a chilling detail later revealed in court. By then, prosecutors accused Louding of 6 murders committed between February 2009 and April 2010, all before he had even turned 18. The speed of the violence was staggering because it was not years separating these crimes. It was months stacked tight, each shooting bleeding into the next until Baton Rouge felt like it was holding its breath. Law enforcement knew they had to build something solid if they wanted to convict, and they started with Louding's own words. Detectives recorded videotaped confessions where he implicated himself and tied Boosie to the Boyd killing. In those tapes, he described details of the shootings, including how much money was promised and how much was actually delivered. The prosecution called those confessions clear proof, while the defense argued they were nothing but coerced statements from a teenager under pressure. Louding's lawyers told the court detectives had questioned him for hours off camera and that they threatened to put his parents in jail. They claimed he was manipulated into saying things that would fit the police narrative. Judge Trudy White refused to throw the tapes out, and jurors eventually saw them played in full. The physical evidence also stacked up. Ballistics experts matched 9mm shell casings from the Boyd murder scene to a weapon later linked to Louding. Prosecutors also leaned on testimony from Adrian Pittman, who admitted he had driven Louding and Ghost Judson to Boyd's house the night of the killing. Pittman told jurors he waited in the car while Louding pulled the trigger, and he later watched him return with the weapon. Investigators even pulled in rap lyrics as evidence, pointing to songs recorded at Boosie's studio around the time of the murder. On one track, he rapped about Marlo Mike up in the back seat begging for a body, which prosecutors said showed the relationship between rapper and teenager. Critics outside the courtroom argued this was criminalizing music, not proving guilt, but the jury still heard it. Phone records placed Louding near Boosie's studio before and after Boyd's murder, tightening the timeline. The tattoo of the AK-47 with the phrase, "Yo Boosie, who's next?" was presented as symbolic evidence showing pride in the killings. A letter prosecutors said came from Boyd threatening to rob Boosie was also used to suggest motive, though its authenticity was never fully proven. Piece by piece, detectives and prosecutors painted a picture of a teenager who confessed, a rapper who allegedly ordered hits, and a city drowning in bullets and rumors. By 2012, Baton Rouge was watching the biggest courtroom drama the city had seen in years. Lil Boosie, real name Torrance Hatch, was sitting in front of a jury facing a first-degree murder charge for the death of Terry Boyd. Prosecutors leaned heavy on the words of Michael Louding, that taped confession where he said Boosie promised money for the job. They played the recordings, showed the tattoo, and tied every thread they could back to the rapper. The state argued that Boosie wanted Boyd gone because of a letter that suggested Boyd planned to rob him. They told jurors this was not rap beef, this was business disguised as music. Still, even with the tape confessions, the case had gaps that could not be ignored. The defense hammered away at one key point. There was no physical evidence tying Boosie to the actual murder. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, and no cash bundles were ever found in his possession. Boosie's lawyers painted the picture of a rapper targeted because of his lyrics and his lifestyle. They told jurors that prosecutors were stretching the music to fit their story. After weeks of testimony and back and forth, the jury stepped out to deliberate. They came back in less than 2 hours, and the verdict shocked many. On May 12th, 2012, the court cleared Boosie of all charges. The reaction split Baton Rouge right down the middle. Supporters celebrated, saying the state had tried to bury a black artist for his music. Critics whispered that Boosie had just beaten a murder rap because nothing stuck hard enough in court. Outside the courthouse, chants of freedom mixed with whispers of guilt. And while controversy still followed him, Boosie walked out free and stepped right back into the rap game. For Michael Louding, the story did not end with freedom. His trial for the murder of Terry Boyd came in 2013, and the weight of the state fell directly on his shoulders. Prosecutors brought more than 20 witnesses to testify, building a case brick by brick against the teenager they now called a cold-blooded killer. They played his tape confession again, brought in ballistics, and leaned on testimony from Adrian Pittman about driving him to Boyd's home. The jury took everything in, and this time the outcome was certain. After 5 hours of deliberation, they found Louding guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction carried a mandatory life sentence without parole in Louisiana, and Judge Trudy White did not hesitate. She sentenced him to die in prison, even though he was only 17 when Boyd was killed. His lawyers tried to challenge the decision, pointing to the Supreme Court ruling in Miller versus Alabama. That case said mandatory life without parole for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment, but the court ruled Miller did not stop judges from giving life if they considered the youth's background. Judge White said she weighed his record, his drug use, his lack of remorse, and she called him a cold-blooded hitman. Family members spoke during sentencing, describing a boy who had grown up around violence, drugs, and the wrong influences. His mother testified that Boosie filled the role of a father figure, and his absence at home left him vulnerable. Supporters said he was just a teenager caught in a bigger game, but in the eyes of the state, his crimes outweighed everything else. His appeals were denied, and by 2013, he was serving life without parole inside Louisiana's prison system. Behind every case file, there were lives that would never come back. Chris "Nussy" Jackson was more than a rival in Baton Rouge rap. He had a fan base growing around his music and a reputation for bringing energy to every performance. Friends said he talked about ending the feud, but he never got the chance. Marcus Thomas was only 20 years old when bullets took him from the driver's seat of his SUV. His death barely made headlines, but his family lost someone who was still trying to figure out his path. Terry Boyd, 35 years old, had just come home from serving time. He was a father, and his children were left without a dad when gunfire tore through that living room window. 19-year-old Michael Smith was found shot behind a house in December 2009. Little was reported about him, but the fact that his life ended before he reached 20 showed how young men in Baton Rouge were being buried too soon. Then there were Charles Matthews and Darrell Bleak Milton, killed together in a Cadillac in April 2010. Milton had talent on the basketball court and dreams of making it further. Matthews was described as quiet, someone who kept his head down and minded his own business. Their families watched them lowered into the ground before they even turned 21. These names rarely made it past local news cycles, but each loss carved deep pain into families and neighborhoods. For them, this story was not about rap beef or courtroom drama. It was about empty chairs at dinner tables and kids growing up without fathers, brothers, or uncles. The story of Michael Louding and Lil Boosie did not stop with the trials. Baton Rouge kept buzzing with rumors, gossip, and debates long after the verdicts came down. Some of it came from blogs, some from YouTube documentaries, and some from neighborhood whispers that refused to die. Swamp Stories released a video in 2024 that went viral, pointing fingers at Boosie and claiming he had ordered multiple killings.
A YouTube channel called Swamp Stories.
I don't let that shit get to me because I know most of that YouTube shit be fabricated stories.
Boosie clapped back on social media, calling it all lies and defending the memory of his late friend, Lil Ivy. Around the same time, Charleston White stirred things up by saying Boosie's past needed another look, reminding everyone of the controversies that refused to fade. People started throwing out wild theories about Louding's mental state, calling him possessed or saying he killed as part of some gang initiation. Bloggers repeated stories about demons and video games, while court records simply showed a boy who grew up around drugs and violence. His mother said he was influenced by Boosie like a father, and his neighbors said they never expected him to be charged with multiple murders. None of the outlandish theories stuck, but they showed how the city filled blanks with gossip when the facts felt too heavy. The case also pushed Baton Rouge into bigger conversations about juvenile sentencing. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. Louisiana responded by passing laws allowing parole hearings after 25 years if certain conditions were met. Louding's lawyers argued that his life sentence should be reconsidered, but the judge ruled that his crimes and lack of remorse outweighed everything else. Appeals went up to higher courts, and every time the sentence was upheld. By 2025, he was still in prison, one of many Louisiana juveniles serving life without parole. Advocates kept saying that science proved teenagers' brains were not fully developed, pointing to studies about impulse and maturity. They argued that someone who killed at 16 might change by 30. Opponents pushed back, saying crimes like multiple murders were too extreme for second chances. Louding's case became one of those examples both sides used, either to push for reform or to warn against leniency. In Baton Rouge, though, most people just remembered the bodies, and their focus stayed on safety and survival. Meanwhile, Boosie kept making music, bouncing between studio sessions, interviews, and more headlines. After his acquittal, he dropped songs with the religious imagery and talked openly about thanking God for freedom. Supporters called him a survivor of a system that tried to use lyrics as evidence, while critics said he walked free because prosecutors lacked enough proof. In 2023, he was arrested again on a federal gun charge in San Diego, proof that controversy stayed close no matter how far he traveled. His reputation remained split. To some, he was a Baton Rouge legend. To others, he was a man forever tied to bloodshed. When you look at the bigger picture, this case was never just about a teenager pulling triggers. It was about Baton Rouge, a city drowning in poverty where rap music became both an escape and an evidence file. It was about how much influence one local rapper could hold and how that influence could inspire both music careers and violent actions. And it was about a justice system that put a teenager away for life while still debating if kids can ever truly be written off. The victims never got to weigh in on those debates. Families buried sons, brothers, and fathers while lawyers argued over confessions, tattoos, and lyrics. To the loved ones of men like Terry Boyd, Marcus Thomas, and Darryl Milton, those details were background noise. They were left staring at photographs and graves, wondering how quickly their lives had been erased. For them, the question was not about juvenile justice or music on trial. It was about grief, loss, and the kind of wounds that never close. By the time reporters looked back on the story years later, the pieces had hardened into a cautionary tale. Baton Rouge rappers spoke on camera about the cost of mixing music and crime. Kevin Gates reminded people that kids would find father figures wherever they could, whether in homes or in the streets. Community organizers called for investment in programs and safe spaces, saying the next Michael Loudon could still be saved if people stepped in early. Some younger rappers moved toward conscious lyrics, while others doubled down on gangster imagery, saying that authenticity was the only thing that sold. The truth is, Michael Loudon's name will always be tied to that haunting statement he made in the interrogation room. He said he did it for Boosie, and those words made sure the story reached far beyond Baton Rouge. Whether coerced or genuine, the confession marked him forever. He was 16, chasing money and recognition, and the cost was 6 lives, his freedom, and his future. For Boosie, the case left scars that followed his career and kept his name tied to controversy even as he released more music. For Baton Rouge, the story was one more chapter in a long fight with poverty, violence, and police distrust. And for the victims' families, it was pain without an ending. In one of the most quoted lines from Boys in the Hood, Doughboy says, "People either do not know, do not show, or do not care about what happens in the hood." The story of Michael Marlowe Mike Loudon forces people to care, because this was not just a movie or a lyric. This was real blood, real lives, and real consequences.